Okay, today we're talking about interest groups and pluralism. Pluralism is just another phrase for talking about, usually in a more positive sense, the rise of interest groups and the impact on government that interest groups have. So we're going to walk through how interest groups influence the government. So what is an interest group? Um, People with shared policy goals entering the policy process at several different points across all the different branches in the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, and pursuing different goals in support of the organization. Um, Interest groups are deeply involved in elections, but they're not presenting candidates for election. They give money and donations to different sides of elections, depending on which candidate they believe will support their policy goals, right? Sometimes they give money to Republicans and Democrats in the same election, um, so that both the Republicans and Democrats will give them favorable treatment after the election. Um, Interest groups are focused usually on very specific interests. So we use often the AARP, which is an interest group in support of elderly folks and their goals, right? Retirements and medical care and those kind of things. AARP is primarily focused on elder kind of care issues. So there's three theories, and we talked about this initially early in the class. There's three theories of kind of interest groups and whether they're good, bad um, for American government. Pluralist theory, elite theory, and hyperpluralist theory. So we're going to go through each one of those. So pluralism um, looks at interest groups as primarily a positive thing, right? And so it says democracy is a vote among a number of different people who have different interests. And so, what's the difference if we take those same people who vote and who make up the um, average American, and we pool and collect all these average Americans together, and together they pool their resources and come up with common ideas for um, representation. If we pool all those things together, how is that any different than individuals voting on their own? They're just voting all together and they're organized, right? So pluralism sees interest groups as really just a more organized form of democracy because each little interest organizes itself into its own group. They pool their resources so that they can have more power than if they were just individuals, and so therefore it sees interest groups as a positive thing. Many center powers, many diverse groups. Some groups win some part of the times, and other groups win at other parts of the time. So there's never any one group that wins all of the time. And these groups connect people to the government in ways that if you were just on your own trying to call your congressman, you may not be able to get through. But if you can always get through to a representative of AARP, maybe they can help you and help connect you to the government. There are rules of the game. The groups compete against each other, um, and within the rules of the game. And just like anything else, they're part of the governmental process, right? So pluralism looks at it as primarily a positive thing for interest groups to have been created. Everyone can lobby, everyone can compete in the rules of the game. Therefore, no one really is at a disadvantage. Now, elitism looks at interest groups and says, well, unfortunately, the interest group um, world is not really run by average Americans, right? It's mainly um, more wealthy people forming groups and assembling the money of other people and then using their own money to get what they want. That's what elitism says. So, um, regardless of regardless of what you want to say about interest groups, according to elitism and the theory of elitism, the upper class will rule, whether it's in government, whether it's in interest groups, um, wherever it is. And so interest groups are just another way for elites to have control and impact on the government. It's not really representative of the country as a whole. That's what an elitism theorist would say. A lot of groups um, with split power doesn't mean anything. Power is not equally divided. Some groups have much more power. The National Rifles Association, AARP, the American Medical Association, American Bar Association, um, have more power than other groups, right? So it's not a representative process or an equal process. The largest corporations use interest groups to develop the most power. So back to the iron triangles that we looked at before, the idea is, well, these interest groups are already locked into iron triangles with um, elites in one industry kind of regulate the other industry and also staff the congressional committees um, on behalf of the Congress people. And so it's really more the elites that interact in these situations. It's not really positive for the average American. And lobbying is a problem because it benefits the few at the expense of the many, right? So that's elitism looks at interest groups as primarily a bad thing. And here's just a chart. This is a little bit dated, but it shows perceptions of the dominance of big interest in corporate American elites. As you can see, it had come down fairly rapidly in 2002. It's now gone back up, right? There's a real concern expressed from people all over the map, from the Pope to the, all kinds of people in government, that there's a concern about the growing wealth gap in America, right? Elites are getting more power, more money than the other people. And so this chart, they extended it out to 2010, would likely see an uptick in the green line, where big interests are seen as more dominant. Hyperpluralism. This goes a step farther and says, rather than the problem is that these elites are just working in it, hyperpluralism goes on to say that groups are so strong that government is weakened. And so that the groups are the ones that are actually running the government on certain policies, right? Iron triangles hold that in place, and interest groups have become too powerful since they can effectively block legislation in certain circumstances because the legislation doesn't align with what they want. So if you think about any kind of legislation in the gun rights area, the NRA is going to be weighing in on that and have a tremendous impact on that legislation. Many sub-governments, right? These iron triangles where you have the interest groups and the congressional committees and then the bureaucracy all working with each other, but all part of the industry that they're regulating. And all of them kind of, one worked for the interest group, then you worked for the government regulating it, then you worked for a congressional committee, and all of them seeking to basically rule that area of law in favor of the industry. When the government tries to please all these different groups, and each group tries to get its own little piece of the pie, then the tax code becomes very confusing. The rest of the statutes become confusing as well, because you have a little exemptions from laws that are only intended to apply to certain circumstances. and it makes the whole thing confusing. As you get more and more interest groups, however, the idea that these are really iron triangles and they're firm and you can't um, dissolve them or destroy them or deconstruct them. We've seen more of the issue network idea pop into popularity. With more and more interest groups, it's seen more as a network rather than an iron triangle. So which theory of interest group politics views interest groups positively? That would be pluralism, right? The other two are negative. So this is just a chart of the top 25 most powerful interest groups. And so as you see here, some of them you may not have known. This is back in 2001, but I think you can still see several of these groups show up today. And so some that you might know of and others that you might not, right? So the National Rifle Association in this situation was viewed as number one, AARP number two, um, National Federation of Independent Business, Trial Lawyers of America, AFL-CIO is the labor union, Chamber of Commerce, beer wholesalers, um, American Medical Association, Home Builders, Motion Picture Association. So there's American Bankers Association down at the bottom, pharmaceutical companies. Now with Obamacare, I bet the pharmaceutical companies have moved up the chain, right? Because in a minute we'll show how much money was spent by the pharmaceutical industry during the Obamacare run. But this is just a kind of a list of the 25 most powerful interest groups. Sometimes groups are ineffective, right? There's been studies that show it's inconclusive whether or not interest group, heavy lobbying in an interest group in an area really actually changes policy. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So there's not a direct correlation all the time to that. Why are large groups not successful? Well, there's always three different groups of people that can be part of an interest group. There's the potential group. So if you looked at everybody anywhere, so um, there might be several people who fit the retirement age, right? They're over 60 or 65, and so they could be part of AARP. But not everyone is a member of AARP, right? They send out a lot of information, but not everyone who qualifies because of age is a member of AARP. You have to pay the membership dues and all that kind of stuff. So you have the potential group. So it's sometimes it's not successful because you don't have all your potential members as part of the group, right? They may disagree with things, and so the group doesn't have all of the resources or all the unified front that it might think it has. The actual group, these are the part of the potential group that do actually join AARP, right? So these are the retired folks that say, yeah, I want AARP to represent me as an interest group. Um, collective group, something of value that cannot be withheld from a group member. So these are kind of um, the the values and other things like that, the perks of being a member of that group, and so something that can't be taken away. So part of the problem is if you're an older person, you don't have to join AARP to get some of the benefits of AARP, right? So if you're concerned about the rising costs of your prescription drugs, AARP will be working on behalf of you, whether you're a member or not, right? Because you're in the age bracket, because you have that concern. The members of AARP share that same concern, and so the lobbying efforts that they're paying for through their membership also go to benefit you. So you kind of get the benefits without having to pay for it. And that's known as the free rider problem, right? or a person doesn't join a group because they benefit from the group's actions without really joining in. The bigger the group, the bigger the problem of the free riders is, right? Large groups are difficult to keep organized. For unions, the right to work laws that have come into place in different states have said um, if there's a union at your workplace, you don't have to be a member of it, and you can still benefit from the collective bargaining, right? So if a union negotiates your wages and vacation um, and insurance, does it kind of collectively on behalf of all the workers for your factory or company, um, even if you're not a member of the union, you're going to benefit from that, right? And the right to work laws in states have said that's perfectly fine. Small groups usually are better organized and they're a smaller, more specific focus, right? Hence, that's why they're smaller groups. But they may not have the resources that are necessary to really make the interest known. So consumer groups have a tough time because of the free rider problem, for sure. So if everyone's going to benefit from safer um, pop caps or something like that, or safer airbags, right? Consumer groups, again, people will say, well, that's great, safer airbags. You guys go ahead and do that. Well, if that group lobbies for safer airbag restrictions, that's going to benefit the entire country. And not everyone in the country is going to pay membership dues to a group working on that behalf. Again, selective benefits. If you can promote, not only do we lobby for you, but we also give you, kind of the AAA idea. We give you full service on this and this, and we can answer your questions related to healthcare, cars, or all that kind of stuff. So here's just a sample of the benefits of membership in AARP. Right, you're a long ways, hopefully, from that, but you get information, insurance, publications, discounts, social events, all that kind of stuff. And so these are what we're seeing as the most important membership benefits. Lobbying is one of those with representation, right? But there's a whole host of other benefits that people identified. Single issue groups. So groups that focus on a narrow interest and dislike compromise. So the NRA would be seen as one of these, where they focus solely on gun rights and they dislike compromise in any way that would compromise gun rights. And it could be, not just the NRA, it could be, racial groups that have an interest in promoting minority rights or something like that. They have a narrow interest, right? Solely associated with whatever they're picking. And some of these groups really, they need to raise money, right? So the groups function when they're able to raise money because people say, oh, this is still a big problem. This group knows how to combat this problem or is working on solving the problem. So we need to give them money to help work on this problem. Well, when you have a situation where there has been, let's say there's a crisis, there's a school shooting or something, and then all the legislation comes out to try and regulate, ammunition, gun control, all that kind of stuff. The NRA will then try to use that. The 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 groups that want to regulate guns, right? So that are against the NRA. Interest groups that want to regulate guns will use these school shootings as an emotional, psychological issue to get people to donate money to them so they can keep pushing for gun regulation, right? So they use it in that way. The NRA will point to that same situation and say, see, look, anytime that something like that happens, um, guns themselves are blamed, not the people that have guns, right? So the NRA will say every time this happens, there's an attempt to roll back your gun rights. So you need to donate money to us and be a member so that then we can combat um, these kind of efforts and be always ready and have the resources to combat those efforts. Um, Smaller groups, or single issue groups, excuse me, more likely to use protests and other means other means of local participation than traditional interest groups that use lobbyists, right? So they'll do protests, they'll have press conferences, those kind of things. A lot of it is intended to, when their single little issue pops up, they need to make use of it through the media, and so that can kind of lead to a vicious cycle where the story is propped up more because the interest group needs to keep it in the public consciousness because that's good not only for its visibility as a group but also for raising money and supporting its organization. So if they can kind of get the media to focus on that single issue and over again through the media cycles, and if the group is seen as a prominent part of that, that raises their profile, can raise their ability to raise money and all that kind of stuff. And part of this, is the goal for the interest group is to raise money so they can stay in existence. Not all groups have equal amounts of money. Um, Money that's given to the group can translate into lobbying efforts, money for politicians, access, phone call with a politician, those kind of things. If there's money, the interest group has supported the politicians that campaign in the past, um, then they can usually call and get a meeting with the politician if the constituent has an issue. And obviously there's a bias towards wealthier groups because they have more money. But even if all the money that they have, they don't always win on elections. The candidate they support doesn't always win, and there's studies that show at a certain point, all the money in the world in the election won't help you. You really do have to connect with voters and all that kind of stuff. And even lobbying Congress on a specific policy or lobbying the executive branch or fighting in court doesn't mean you're going to be successful in a policy area. The same kind of thing applies. So just the number of interest groups has vastly increased in the different areas that they find themselves in. Here's a couple charts from 1959 and then one from 1995 of the different areas of interest groups and the percentages and whatnot. As you can see, healthcare has grown quite a bit. Trade has actually shrunk, and that would be, kind of trade unions and those kind of things. But we've seen other areas and groups expand. As I mentioned before earlier, the pharmaceutical companies spent a tremendous amount of money. This is a chart of which interest group spent the most from 2009 to 2011. The pharmaceutical companies spent a lot, largely due to Obamacare, right? That was going to potentially have a huge impact on their industry. They have a lot of money to spend, and they spent it on lobbying during that time period, largely to impact Obamacare. And you see a lot of health related, you see hospitals on here, you see health professionals. Obamacare was impacting that quite a bit, right? Insurance industry spends a lot on that, oil and gas. The computers internet area, I'm sure, is growing as well. So there's a lot of money spent on lobbying. What is lobbying? Well, it's communication by someone other than the citizen acting on his own behalf, directed to a governmental decision maker with the hope of influencing the decision, right? So it's someone on behalf. A lobbyist is someone communicating with a government decision maker, representing somebody else with the hope of influencing the decision, right? You have two types. There's those that are actually on staff of a group, right? So AARP will have lobbyists on staff, and the bigger groups, they have a whole team of lobbyists that are just on staff, right? They're employees of the company. There's others that are hired temporarily so they have lobbying groups. So let's say you have, Waters and Waters lobbying group. If you hire Waters and Waters lobbying group, then they will assign one of their lobbyists to help you with your cause on a temporary basis for that issue, or as long as you want and willing to pay for it. So a lot of people give lobbyists a bad name. My experience with them has been different. They can be an important source of information because, again, they're real policy experts. They're paid to be experts in the area that they're working in, right? So they're experts at the legislative process, so they can help politicians plan for how to get through that process. They can plan strategies for re-election campaigns. They can provide sample laws and draft laws that the politician can then use, and that happens fairly frequently. And then the politician can take credit for it. So lobbyists, perform a lot of roles that are essential in government. And if they didn't play these, we'd have to try and find somebody else to play them, and that could be challenging. So not everyone has the time to be an expert in policy areas. Electioneering, right? Lobbyists get directly involved in elections. A lot of the efforts now are done through political action committees. So interest groups can donate money to these committees in almost unlimited amounts. The PACs help pay the bill and so you can't really have a campaign now if you don't have a large political action committee. So every candidate now running for president, excuse me, will have a political action committee that interest groups donate to, and that political action committee really serves as kind of as their own little party, right? And they don't have to listen to what the Democratic or Republican Party says. You can have political action committees that are very focused on a single issue or want to run a certain kind of commercial on behalf of the candidate, which isn't from the candidate's campaign and is separate, but still benefits the candidate, right? And again, most of the political action committee money goes to the incumbents. So we've talked about this case before, the Citizens United case, but I just want to hit it one more time again. Citizens United, there were rules in place that wouldn't allow political action committees, and the money in elections was highly regulated prior to the Citizens United. Okay, so in 2002, Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, otherwise known as the McCain-Feingold Act, it prohibited corporations and unions from using their general fund for any kind of electioneering communications, right? Within 30 days of a primary or 60 days before an election. So it regulated how corporations and unions use their money in that way. The holding of Citizens United, however, was that it was unconstitutional to ban this kind of contributions because it said political speech through the donation of money is one of the most important parts of free speech. And so there are not limits on how much a donor can contribute to a campaign effectively, right? Justice Kennedy had delivered the majority opinion that found that McCain-Feingold was unconstitutional, and it removed a lot of the regulations. So if you watched campaigns prior to the Citizens United ruling, they looked quite a bit different than what they look now, and the players are certainly different and under different umbrellas than they were before. Some people think that Citizens United has been a very good thing, right? Because it's opened up money into politics in a way that was highly restricted before, and they think that the money has come more into the light as a result of allowing it to be legal, right? It's kind of one of these things that if it's illegal, to donate that much, well then people will still get it done and just do it in shady ways that you can't really trace as well. Well, now with Citizens United, people say that, well, that's come into light more. So here's kind of the impact on campaign spending. And this is not all the way through this is a chart that was done before 2014 was completed. And 2014 ended up exceeding 2012. But as you can see, campaign spending is up exponentially. And this was a midterm election. This wasn't a presidential election that we saw there, right? So we've seen a tremendous increase in the amount of money in campaigns and elections. Besides elections, interest groups, as we talked about in the judicial branch section, can also try to take things to court. And so if something, they can't get laws passed through Congress, or they can't get the rule in the executive branch, the interest group can help pay for someone to take a case, right? So if I'm a Joe Schmo and I have a good case that will benefit the interest group if I win, they'll pay for my lawyers, right? The interest group will pay for my lawyers. If they don't do that, then, and it's a separate thing, they can also file amicus briefs, as we talked about before, and kind of lobby the judicial branch through the briefs that they file in support of whatever position that they're taking. Class action lawsuits as a way of group of people, harmed by a certain drug, or let's say you see these commercials where, have you been injured because of fen-phen or whatever the drug may be, sign up with this lawyer and this law firm as a class action, and we're going to sue the manufacturers of that drug. You see all kinds of things like that where people join together to try to win a lawsuit. Groups can go to the public, right? They can have commercials, try to improve the image of their group, use marketing strategies to create a positive public opinion for the group. And they'll try to get a lot of backing behind whatever thing they're doing. So you see a lot of advertisements about oil pipelines and how safe they are and good for the economy in the Midwest right now. Because, we've had 2 proposed big pipelines through South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, and they've had varying levels of success. And so the groups in support of the pipelines are going to keep advertising to keep a positive image, hopefully, in the minds of Midwesterners, so that they won't fight so strongly against those. So, on what tactic do interest groups rely on to influence policy when Congress is unsympathetic, right? Well, when they've not made it through Congress, they go to court, right? And through litigation. So litigation is a fancy word for going to court. You have several different types of it. These are just samples of types of interest groups. Labor groups with unions, agricultural interest groups, business interest groups, environmental interest groups, the minority equality interest groups that we talked about before, consumer and public interest groups, where they're trying to keep products safe for the public, those kind of things, and food safety, food security groups that are trying to make food, more fresher and all that kind of stuff. Now, again, there's a debate of interest groups. What are interest groups' effect on democracy? Well, if government was wide open and took all groups, right, and could deal with all groups, the idea would be that, well, groups on one side of an issue will counterbalance groups on another side of an issue. And it's really no different. It's a democratic thing, and interest groups aren't that bad, because if you allow them all onto the playing field, they will balance each other out with money and whatnot, and you won't ever have factions getting too strong in government, right? It's still in the same kind of Madison. They are factions, but they're under control because they can counterbalance each other. And so some people see as a majority of lobbyists, you have an informed, connected group because the lobbyists can help connect the average person to the government in ways that they probably would not be connected to um, on their own outside of a group. And so that some people think that's a better um, situation for democracy. Others say the idea that one group counterbalances the other. There's no group that can be comparable to the NRA, for instance. Right? The groups that want to regulate firearms just don't have the political power, resources, organization that the NRA has. So there isn't a balance there, some would argue. And they say, well, that's not good for democracy, and certain, and according to some. Interest groups, some interest groups are very interested in limited government, right? Other interest groups want to see policies implemented. Any kind of policy that's implemented is going to grow the government, right? So new law, new policy means the government gets bigger. You need people to enforce those laws. Um, interest groups, by and large, are not trying to shrink government. They're trying to get government to do more things on behalf of who they're working for, whatever their group's personal interest is, right? But as government does more things and does things to another side of an issue that they don't like, that gives rise to an interest group in that area, and we keep going with numerous interest groups to keep up with the size of government. So, who are the business interests, right? That a lot of the business interests, you have Sheldon Alderson, who is a big casino magnate in Las Vegas, usually gives a lot of money. The Koch brothers are famous conservative political action committee campaign spenders, businessmen. You also have, on the other, you have a lot of environmental um, um, interest group people that give just as much as those individuals we mentioned before. But all business isn't unified on every single issue, right? There's differences between them. Environmental interests sprang up, with kind of as the environmental movement grew, right? You've had more and more groups, not surprisingly, and now they're a major force in politics, right? So the defeat of the pipeline that I mentioned before, the defeat of the oil refinery in Union County, South Dakota. Um, but they have more numbers and kind of more intensity, it seems, than actual money. So they have been growing in popularity. They're still not at the level of an AARP or NRA or something like that. Quality interests, right? The NAACP, National Association for Colored People. That was the group that was involved with Brown v. Board and helped with that case. They're involved in a lot of other situations on behalf of African Americans. Um, women's groups, you have the National Organization for Women, and you still have some groups out there for the Equal Rights Amendment, but they're not as prominent anymore. They were back in the day, back in when the Equal Rights Amendment was being talked about as part of the Constitution. So, sample question: what do hyperpluralists see as a problem with the proliferation of interest groups? And the answer is obviously B. I think too many groups competing will lead to policy gridlock, right? So hyperpluralists see that the government can't function because one group can always check the other one and stop